Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Mike Burke and from Columbia University this week to give us our inaugural Rising Star Lectureship. Please allow me to introduce Professor Mike Burke, and we were the lab mates at Princeton. And Professor Mike Burke is currently Associate Professor of Mechanical Engineering at Columbia University. He also holds affiliate appointments in Chemical Engineering at the Data Science Institute. Mike serves as a colloquium co-chair for gas phase chemical kinetics at the 38th International Symposium on Combustion, Awards Committee Chair, and the Executive Board member of the Eastern States section of the Combustion Institute, and Advisory Board member for the Kinetics. Prior to joining Columbia in 2014, he earned his PhD in mechanical and aerospace engineering in 2011 at Princeton University, where we worked together in Professor Yu's lab. And Mike is co-advised by Professor Yu and Professor Fred Dreyer there. He also worked as a director's postdoc fellow in the Chemical Science and Engineering Division at Argonne National Lab. Mike is a recipient of the Combustion Institute's Research Excellence Award, the National Science Foundation's Career Award, and the American Chemical Society PRF Doctoral New Investigator Award. His publications have been featured in the News and Views section of Nature Chemistry, selected as the featured article in Combustion and Flame, and chosen for the Distinguished Paper Award at the 31st International Symposium on Combustion. Okay, Mike, all yours.
All right, thanks, Wenting, for the introduction, and thanks to you and the other panelists and organizers and many committee members for really providing this opportunity for us to come together, even in this strange environment, to connect from all across the world. So thank you to all of you that are tuning in on a Saturday morning or Saturday evening, I suppose, Saturday night for many. And thanks for giving me the chance to give a talk here. If you have questions along the way, feel free to shout out either in the chat or the, just out loud with your microphone. So to start, I'll also start off by thanking the PhD students in my group, and I'll be pointing out their work that contributed to the many ideas that I'll be presenting, and thanks to our sponsors here as well. So as you can gather from the abstract and the title, what I'll be focusing on here is the challenges that I see in extrapolating knowledge of complex reactions to new thermodynamic conditions, which it turns out is a very common need in many complex reaction systems, and one that's not so easy. So then we'll talk through how theoretical chemistry, multiscale modeling, and uncertainty quantification can be blended together to form this cohesive strategy for creating complex models that you can extrapolate with a level of confidence that you can quantify and count on. Complex reactions occur and control phenomena in a wide range of engineering relevant and natural systems here. In combustion, which I suspect this audience is most familiar, complex reactions control heat release rates, NOx and soot emissions, a whole host of other factors relevant to engine performance and design. But then even for vehicles re-entering the Earth's atmosphere from space, propelled by gravity to hypersonic speeds, complex reactions that occur as they literally rip through the air in front of them control whether these vehicles will melt and burn up by the time they reach the surface, and how to design the system so that that doesn't happen. Even beyond engineering into natural systems, think about complex reactions in the atmosphere, which control the evolution of compounds as they evolve in the atmosphere, their ultimate fate, influencing local air quality, global climate. And then down here, and brace yourself for a morning or evening or nighttime pun, complex reactions out of this world control are thought to control the potential formation of life outside of our planet and elsewhere in the universe. All right, I'll stop for now. So suffice it to say, being able to understand and predict the outcomes from these complex reactions would be immensely useful for engineering design, policy decisions, and even our innate sense of wonder. Now, doing so is no easy task because complex reactions are complex. And so they're complex in the very sense that complex reactions are defined, which is that they don't proceed through a single step. They proceed through many intermediate species undergoing many intermediate reactions. And here are just two examples. So over here on the left, an example that's perhaps familiar to many of you for combustion-generated NOx emissions. Over here on the right, an example that may be less familiar, familiar to some perhaps. This involves oxidation of isoprene in the Earth's atmosphere. Isoprene is a compound emitted naturally from trees, but its reactions control things related to local air quality, lifetime of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, aerosol and cloud formation, and ultimately global climate as a result. One thing that these two reaction systems have in common, despite the diversity of the domains they come from, is that what I'm showing here is just a small snippet, a small piece of a much larger complex kinetic mechanism. In both cases involving hundreds of intermediate species, undergoing thousands of intermediate reactions. Each of these with rates that depend on the local instantaneous temperature, pressure, and species mole fractions. So an 100-dimensional vector here. So that already tells us a couple things. First is that any single measurement, which is likely to be affected by many different things. So a measurement of a particular species would be affected by many different reactions and many different parameters. So attributing any single measurement to a single parameter is not so easy to do, if not impossible. Furthermore, even the pathways through which these molecules traverse the reaction network and the rate constants themselves depend sensitively on the temperature, pressure, and mixture composition. In fact, it was this very complex nature of combustion and complex reactions complicating extrapolation that drew people to the hydrogen explosion limits. And so this was one of the first things that Hinshelwood, Semenov, and Lewis and von Elb and others learned when analyzing the explosion limits. And Paul Ronnie, in his webinar just a few weeks ago, gave a nice exposition of these explosion limits. So at least for the present purposes, I'll focus on the key aspects of the story. Which is that if hydrogen combustion proceeded through a single step, so rather than a complex reaction, you'd expect to see temperature and pressure dependence like the first limit. You increase temperature or you increase pressure, you get an explosion. But as the story goes, that's not what people saw, of course. Extrapolation of this line to higher pressures would yield even qualitatively erroneous results, all coming from the unique, stronger pressure dependence of the termolecular association reaction of H plus O2 plus M. So one of the reactions present in this 20 reaction system complicated the extrapolation because of its unique temperature, pressure, and mixture composition dependence. So here, extrapolation is not easy, and the condition dependence is a key aspect of the overall behavior. So now, flash forward by about 100 years, from the 19 teens and 20s to around the mid-2000s. At this point, there were extensive investigations of hydrogen combustion across an impressive range of temperatures, pressures, equivalence ratios, diluents, dilution levels, various combustion properties too, ignition delay times, species profiles, flame speeds, and as it were, flame speeds even at high pressure conditions from Ed Law's group at Princeton back in 2000. Needless to say, and this was a plot that I came upon as a graduate student when I was working with Yi Guang and Fred Dreyer, I was a bit surprised, at least, that model predictions of the mass burning rate, which is a density-weighted flame speed, the model predictions agreed at low pressures, like you might expect, but in going out to higher pressures, the models all diverged quite rapidly. So reaching a factor of 2 or even 4 at these high pressure conditions. These differences seemed especially surprising given that most of these models had already been validated against high pressure flame speeds, merely with slightly less dilution. This suggested to me, at least, that it's not so easy to know when you can trust a model result, even if you're at conditions close to where it's been validated. So it might be nice to quantify the uncertainty associated with the extrapolation. It also implied the possibility of blind spots, even in the most comprehensive data sets. And as it turns out, these are challenges observed in many other complex reactions, ranging from NOx to low temperature heptane combustion to a wide range of other complex reactions, even outside of combustion. So let's dig into these challenges a bit more. Let's figure out what's known and what's not, and then how we can address them. So first is that the reactions themselves have rate constants that could be functions of temperature, pressure, and mixture composition, which is a rather daunting parameter space. Now, fortunately, extensive study on temperature and pressure dependence has already enabled reliable frameworks for treating them in combustion modeling. Now, unfortunately, as it were, these frameworks are largely premised on the bath gas being a pure inert substance. So the bath gas M that participates in reactions like H plus O2 plus M. But in combustion and many other complex reaction systems, we have a rate constant that depends on this many-dimensional vector because we have mixtures. Raising the questions, well, what if M is a mixture? How can you use what's known about these pure substances to predict properties in mixtures? And then perhaps more interestingly, what happens if M is a radical? You might get a very different outcome, but there's high fractions of reactive species in combustion, like radicals and molecular oxygen, that could give rise to very different outcomes than M when colliding with a row vibrationally excited complex. And then let's not forget that we've got thousands of these things, each with complex dependence. So learning about any one of them experimentally is not so straightforward. So what that brings to mind is questions like these. Well, how can you learn from that data? How can you keep track of what's known and what's not known? And then can you do that in a way that you can extrapolate so that you can quantify model predictions and their uncertainties, even at conditions different than the validation set? And then if there's blind spots, what happens if that's not good enough? So in this vast thermodynamic space that we're interested in, it's bound to happen, at least for some quantities of interest. And so in that case, how do you fill those blind spots to try to address those uncertainties that could then be propagated out to new predictions with more refined error bars? So now we've talked only about the challenges, which probably at this point seem awfully overwhelming, especially seeing that combustion models for a foundational fuel built on 100+ years of combustion knowledge, which is impressive, we're still unconstrained at the high pressures and low temperatures of most immediate interest to advanced high-efficiency, low-NOx engines. Now, in reality, and this is the part that we haven't talked about so far, the field has come an awfully long way in addressing many of these challenges. So for the rest of the talk, I'll talk about how we can build off of previous knowledge and techniques to address the remaining questions with just the right blend of buzzwords: theoretical chemistry, multiscale modeling, and uncertainty quantification, so that we can create models that can extrapolate with some confidence that we can count on. So first, we'll start with composition dependence. And this is where building off of previous knowledge is especially useful, just like for the other two areas that I'll talk through later on in this presentation. And here, ab initio-based master equation methods for dealing with temperature and pressure dependence from Jürgen Troe, Stephen Klippenstein, Jim Miller, and others can be applied to answer these questions relating to the underlying physics in mixtures and understanding composition dependence to match the level of understanding that we currently have for temperature and pressure dependence. So that's the goal. So let's dig in a bit on this one and see how far this gets us. For context here, pressure, and for that matter, composition dependence in gas phase chemical kinetics for combustion and other complex reactions comes from the fate of ephemeral complexes, rho vibrationally excited complexes formed from association of two molecules, A and B. Now, if we're at low enough pressures, these AB star stars simply dissociate back to A plus B and yield no net reaction. But as you increase the pressure, you increase the collision rate, and so you provide some possibility that ephemeral complexes could undergo a collision with some species here, M, a third body, a bath gas molecule. It goes by many different names. The outcome is generally the same. In this instance, it could take away some of the energy in a way that would allow this to become stabilized and thermalized. And so this two-step, three-reactant sequence of A plus B plus M, phenomenologically, the kind that you'd represent in kinetic models would be a termolecular association reaction, A plus B plus M. I would suspect that this part may be familiar to most of you. Now, the rate constant that you get from this depends on pressure through the pressure dependence of the collision rate, and likewise the pressure dependence of the energy transfer rate, which is what gives rise to this stabilization that can occur. Now, it's been known for quite some time now that different substances can have different rates of energy transfer, even for the same temperature and pressure. So rate constants at a given temperature and pressure for polar polyatomic molecules like water could be much higher than those for nitrogen or argon or helium. And so that could have some impact on the overall behavior. But as I mentioned before, most of our current frameworks for pressure dependence are largely premised on theories and data for pure components. So generally pure nitrogen or pure water. And then in combustion modeling and experimental interpretations, where you have mixtures, the rate constant in the mixture is almost inevitably calculated by some version of the classic linear mixture rule, which estimates the rate constants in the mixture It estimates rate constants in the mixture from the rate constants of the constituent components when pure, evaluated at the temperature and pressure of the mixture, all weighted by the mole fractions. Now, it turns out, and has been known for quite some time now, that the linear mixture rule, like many rules, is not quite a rule per se. It's more of a convenient approximation. So deviations of the linear mixture rule were the topic of extensive investigation prior to to around 1990 or so. And here are just a couple of those studies. But it turns out that the linear mixture rule had scarcely been tested in the intermediate fall-off regime, relevant to many combustion reactions, or for more complex reactions, those involving multiple potential energy wells and multiple product channels, which are also quite common in combustion systems. So this motivated Lei and me to embark on a series of master equation calculations of prototypical reactions to quantify the deviations from the linear mixture rule, which we found to be relatively significant. So then we went about trying to understand the failures and develop some new mixture rules that could accommodate mixture dependence a bit better. Now, it's Lei's birthday today, or yesterday, so my group insisted that he get a birthday hat. So here he is with a birthday hat. So here are some results from those master equation calculations. Here's what we found for H plus O2 plus M and formaldehyde dissociation to the higher energy radical forming channel in mixtures of water and argon. And here I'm plotting deviations of the linear mixture rule from master equation calculations of the rate constant used as a benchmark as a function of the water mole fraction in both cases. What we noticed here is two main things. First is that the deviations tend to be largest for water mole fractions around 10 to 20%, which unfortunately is exactly where we are in most combustion mixtures, in the post reaction zone and even the peak radical zone. The deviations also reach around 60% for simple single channel reactions like this one, but also reach an order of magnitude for multi-channel reactions like this one. So after seeing these failures, we dug into why. And it turns out it mostly has to do with the fact that energy transfer rates and the rate constants, like we talked about before, for different substances can vary a lot even at the same temperature and pressure. So evaluating the contributions at the temperature and pressure of the mixture is not the best basis for evaluating them. So instead, it makes much more sense to construct a mixture rule in terms of the reduced pressure, R. The reduced pressure, just for some context here, is a common non-dimensional pressure used for interpreting pure bath gases. And it's effectively a representation of the energy transfer rate in the low pressure limit. And so the energy transfer rates, and likewise the rate constants for different substances, if they're evaluated at the same temperature and reduced pressure, tend to be much more similar. And this provides a much more forgiving basis for averaging the contributions from each substance. And so this forms our new reduced pressure-based mixture rule. On the whole, as you can see here, the deviations are then reduced to around 10% to 30%, which is probably good enough for most reactions. But for some, you might like to know it just a little bit better. In looking at these a bit more, you can see that the largest deviations happen at low pressures. So these are nonlinearities that present themselves even in the low pressure limit. But it turns out even those can be addressed under certain approximations by extending analytical solutions of the master equation by Jürgen Tro to multi-channel reactions in multi-component bath gas, yielding what Lei and I call a nonlinear reduced pressure mixture rule. Overall here, it reduces the deviations to around 3 to 10%. So these seem to show promise for representing mixture effects. But as it stands, these mixture rules have yet to be incorporated into combustion codes like ChemKin or Kentera, which for the most part presently use the linear mixture rule for many reactions. Furthermore, we haven't gotten around to testing multi-well reactions in earnest yet. And so I'd say the performance there, while results are initially promising, I'd say is still something that needs to be ironed out. And then finally, even if you have reliable structures for evaluating rate constants in mixtures from data for pure components, you still need good data for the pure components. And that's where I think some ongoing trajectory calculations by Aaron Jasper, Akira Matsugi, and others will be important to really figuring that out. So thinking about mixtures of inert substances, as you might recall, is only half of the picture, because there's also high fractions of reactive species, like radicals or molecular oxygen in common combustion scenarios. And those reactive species might do more than merely transfer energy. They might react. And so by complete analogy of this two-step, three-reactant sequence of A plus B plus M, giving rise to the familiar termolecular association reaction, the sequence of A plus B plus C gives rise to another type of termolecular reaction, a chemically termolecular reaction, one where each reactant is intimately involved in the bond breaking and making, and so is involved in the chemistry. Interestingly, these reactions were hypothesized back in the early studies by Hinchelwood and Semenoff of chain reactions. But around the 1960s or so, it was largely thought that these reactions were either unphysical or unimportant. But in reality, they just hadn't been tested. So master equation calculations performed as part of a paper that I wrote with Stephen Klippenstein here in Nature Chemistry revealed that these reactions can be major pathways in combustion environments and have significant influence on global or macroscopic behavior. For example, here's some predictions of hydrogen flame speeds using a model considering only the three usual types shown here in blue, the three usual types being unimolecular, bimolecular, and termolecular association reactions. And then here in red are the predictions with this fourth type, chemically termolecular reactions, involving H plus O2 plus H, OH, or O. So altogether, these appear to have a sizable impact on the flame predictions and constitute a major pathway here. It turns out half of the flux through HO2 proceeds through chemically termolecular reactions rather than termolecular association reactions. So with this discovery of, or rediscovery, if you will, of chemically termolecular reactions came the realization that combinatorially, there's thousands that are possible. And there's no rate constants for any of them. And detailed master equation calculations of the type used on the previous slide are not so practical for thousands of reactions, at least at present. But fortunately, it's likely the case that only a small handful of these things are actually going to matter. But still, it's not straightforward to know right away which ones are going to be important and worth pursuing with master equation calculations and which ones aren't. And this is where automated discovery comes in. So in a paper led by Mark Barbette in my group, we presented an automated discovery procedure that could identify and then estimate rate constants for all the possibilities based on a simple Lindemann scheme like this one, and available knowledge in existing kinetic models. So you could siphon through the many possibilities by screening for their importance through running combustion simulations to figure out which ones matter. And so Mark applied this technique to hydrocarbon combustion, and Roger Cornell recently applied this technique as well to energetic materials combustion. And so they found a handful of reactions in each that seem to have noticeable impact on the global behavior from the system. Now, we've come full circle on this now. We took one of these reactions found by Mark's code, H plus acetylene plus O2, and then we did some master equation calculations, as I'll present on the next slide. So we confirmed that it was important, and so in the end, we're suggesting that this approach could be effective as a result. So here are Lay's master equation results for the impact of this reaction on flame speeds for acetylene, or sorry, these are ignition delay times for acetylene air. It turns out the differences attributed to including these sorts of effects can reach an order of magnitude or even more, and even qualitatively show differences in, say, the molecular oxygen mole fraction dependence, which in a sense you can think of as a ratio of reactive to energy transferring collisions. And thus the importance of chemically termolecular reactions or non-equilibrium reactions in general. What's also interesting about this is that I suspect this is the sort of thing that could be studied experimentally. So it could provide an experimental confirmation of something that we predict would happen. So now we've talked through just a handful, and we've talked through a strategy that could be used to find more. But there's still likely more to be discovered through automated methods or conventional human intuition. So Aaron Jasper, Raghu, Severakrishnan, and ubiquitou at Argonne have already found some others that seem to be of importance to flames. There's probably even some more yet to be uncovered. Now, the other major challenge I see is that it's still not clear how to represent these in combustion modeling, especially when considering this now very complex composition dependence, where there's both many inert species and even some reactive species. And so Lay and I are trying to transfer our expertise for inert mixtures to reactive mixtures, but that's still a work in progress. So stay tuned is about all I can say about that. So to this point, we've talked through bullet number 1, so the underlying physics for composition dependence, and some frameworks or seedlings of frameworks for representing them. But then we still have this problem of, well, what do we do with thousands of them? When non-ambiguous interpretations of complex data is not straightforward. Now, fortunately, in this regard, inverse uncertainty quantification methods, like advanced by Michael Franklock, Hai Wang, Tomasz Taranyi, Habib Najim, and many others, can help address these first 2 questions, which is quantifying what's learned from complex data. What I'll talk about here is how these methods can be blended with modern theoretical chemistry and multiscale modeling to tackle this third challenge. So enabling these uncertainties to be quantified under extrapolation. So let's start with a bit of background about how inverse UQ works, and then we'll dig in a bit deeper. So the goal of most inverse uncertainty quantification methods for kinetics and kinetic model development approaches in general is to come up with a set of rate parameters within a kinetic model informed by data at macroscopic scales. So like species mole fractions in flow reactors, ignition delay times in shock tubes, and so on, where rate constants in a kinetic model can be related to those macroscopic observables through 0D reactor, 1D flame models as implemented in ChemKin or Cantera, or even CFD codes for that matter. And then the way UQ proceeds goes like this. You'd start by varying parameters in the kinetic model, so you can map out the response of some prediction, YP, to variations in the active uncertain model parameters. And here's a cartoon from a paper from Michael Franklock, who is a pioneer in this area. And these show predictions for some quantity of interest, YP, for different values of the rate constant for 2 reactions. Here are the predictions, and here this green shaded area is the region that satisfies prior knowledge. So you see a large variation in the predictions of YP based solely on the prior knowledge. From here, you can create a local surrogate model representation describing this response. It's an analytical expression that you can then use for inverting constraints from macroscopic data. So take, for example, there's a measurement of YP, reducing the uncertainty in the prediction to within this bound, restricting the portion of the response surface that satisfies the data, and in doing so, restricting the values for those rate constants that are consistent with that data. So that's the red portion here, which is the posterior model, if you will, whereas the green is the prior knowledge. Now, these techniques are obviously very powerful in learning about model parameters from complex data affected by lots of parameters and helping you keep track of what's known and what's not known. The challenge I see, though, with any rate parameter-based modeling approach, whether it's mathematically formal uncertainty quantification or even traditional comprehensive kinetic modeling, is that there's rarely enough data to constrain the full temperature, pressure, and composition dependence of each of the rate constants, which is exactly what you'd need for reliable extrapolation. And so this is where I see ideas for multiscale modeling and the rising accuracy of ab initio theoretical kinetics calculations as being useful for direct incorporation into the UQ modeling strategy. And so this forms the basis for a method that I call multiscale informatics. So instead of inferring rate parameters within semi-empirical fitting expressions, the goal of multiscale informatics, or MSI for short, is to learn about a set of molecular parameters, like barriers to reaction, or vibrational frequencies, or hindered rotor potentials, that can be related to rate constants through kinetics theories like transition state theory or RKM master equation calculations. And then after doing this for a series of reactions, you can build up a full kinetic model this way, which you could then relate to macroscopic observables again through reactor models as before. And when you do the analysis this way, you can also incorporate data from both the macroscopic scale observed experimentally, but then also the molecular scale calculated from first principles. And so then for the inverse uncertainty quantification, we follow similar methods to those elsewhere, where we construct a surrogate model. We do nonlinear least squares, uncertainty weighted error minimization, and then iterate on this until we get a converged set of active parameters, which in this case are molecular properties, and a covariance matrix representing their uncertainties and cross correlations. Now, the advantage I see of extending down to molecular parameters is that they're completely independent of temperature, pressure, and composition. So if you can use data of macroscopic measurements to better inform features of a potential energy surface, those don't depend at all on the local thermodynamic conditions. So then you can extrapolate out to new thermodynamic conditions through physics-based models, and thereby potentially overcoming the challenges in extrapolating in vast thermodynamic space. Now, a good example of the complexities that can arise in condition dependence of rate constants, and likewise the approach's ability to unravel them, is the OH plus HO2 reaction, relevant to high pressure flame predictions and the subject of considerable controversy. The controversy being that some experiments showed a highly anomalous minimum. Other experiments were remarkably consistent with a constant activation energy extrapolation of the low temperature data. So some thought there was no minimum. And then theory said there was a minimum, but quantitatively, it didn't agree with the data, differing by about a factor of 2 or 3. So we put together a multi-scale model for this system for the 5 key reactions involved in these high temperature determinations, and then included the raw data from these experiments as macroscopic observables. So instead of putting them into the analysis as rate constants, we put them in as global system measurements. The reason being is that this would allow the possibility of the analysis finding a different explanation of the same data than the original interpretations. In the end, the analysis did identify a consistent explanation of all the data, theory and experiment, including the raw data from these high temperature determinations over here. And the way it did that was by accounting for uncertainties in the molecular parameters, so uncertainties in the barrier height for this reaction, better knowledge of secondary reaction chemistry at intermediate temperatures, and then different physical model parameters. In this case, it was an arbitrary level of H-atom doping impurities to represent the contribution of impurities in the experiment to the observed measurements. But what this analysis implies is a different rate constant, shown here in blue, than either theory or the high temperature determinations. Now, it's worth pointing out that while it looks like this blue line from the multiscale informatics analysis disagrees with the high temperature data, it agrees with the raw data from those experiments. Here, the blue line shows just as good of performance as the green line used to interpret the original data plotted here. Now, the blue interpretations, the multiscale informatics interpretations, were then consistent with even theory data too. So after going out on a limb, reinterpreting data that was from the literature, was a bit nervous, at least at first. So suffice it to say, I took a sigh of relief when Ron Hansen, Dave Davidson, and Zikai Hong sent me a copy of their own independent study, experimental study at intermediate temperatures, which was remarkably consistent with our analysis. So altogether, this implied to me that the conclusions we came to seemed valid, and that the approach showed promise for unraveling data from complex reactions into reliable rate constants, even when they have complex condition dependence like this one. So some further confirmation was then later provided from some high-level ab initio calculations by John Stanton and Stephen Klippenstein. These were for barrier heights for a different reaction in the system. And here is the prior model used in our analysis based on standard ab initio calculations. You can see they have fairly large confidence intervals. Down here is the multiscale informed model confidence intervals. So altogether suggesting an adjustment in the barrier height down and tighter uncertainties. And it seemed to be in consistency with those higher level ab initio calculations. Altogether suggesting that the analysis could predict even molecular properties based on prior knowledge. Furthermore, over here, here's some predictions of OH mole fractions in shock tubes corresponding to the measurements from the Hansen group I showed on the prior slide. So these are what could be considered the macroscopic observables from that experiment. And these were not included in the original analysis either. So both of these would show the ability of this sort of approach in truly predicting later data with minimal and reliable error bars, which seem to overlap with the data in both cases. So now we're using multiscale informatics as a tool for unraveling data from complex reactions into high accuracy kinetics parameters with the active thermochemical tables from Rusich as our inspiration. And so here, the data, the raw data, and the use of theory are among the key elements of the analysis. So here's some results from Carly Lagrada's work. And Carly Lagrada's multiscale informed models have shown interpretations of data shown in blue here that gave a different temperature dependence than some rate parameter based optimization methods. And while both optimizations use theory among the constraints, they do so in a different way. It turns out the use of theory directly within the model structure, within the multi-scale informed models, helps it remain consistent qualitatively and physically with the theory calculations. We're also in the midst of a collaboration with the Hansen group over here on the HO2 plus HO2 reaction. And the goal of this is to try to see whether the raw data from these experiments, shown in green here, is consistent with Stephen Klippenstein's latest calculations shown here in red, which show a different temperature dependence and also show the existence of additional pathways that weren't considered in any previous analysis of the system. And so the question is whether the raw data from these experiments is consistent with the theory, because despite the differences in the description between the two, because extrapolating out to higher temperatures makes a big difference when it comes to high pressure flame speed predictions, where the temperature dependence of this rate constant out at 1600 or so Kelvin could be important to resolving. We're also starting to use, thinking bigger here, multiscale informatics as a tool for full multiscale combustion models. And this is a work in progress, but it's really made possible from some substantial code improvements and developments spearheaded by Carly Lagrada, but then also with substantial contributions from Mark Barbette and Lele. So here's some early results from Carly's work on putting together a hydrogen combustion model. And here's some early results from Roger Cornell's work, trying to put together a model for HON systems of relevance to ammonia combustion and NOx and hydrogen combustion. And as a result, many energetic materials applications in general. So these are works in progress, so stay tuned as we go along. So by this point, we've talked through ways that UQ, theoretical chemistry, and multi-scale modeling can help address these challenges in extrapolating out to new conditions. This last point that I'll touch on only very briefly here is what happens if the model is still not good enough. Now, fortunately, the very idea of comprehensively validated models from Dreyer and Westbrook already goes a really long way toward just minimizing the potential for this to happen. From there, Bayesian design can pick it up. So Bayesian design methods from Habib Najim, David Sheen, and others can find experiments that fill those blind spots for some quantity of interest. So what I'll talk about next is how blending those with multi-scale modeling and theoretical chemistry has additional advantages, in the sense that you can use experiments that could be very far in terms of thermodynamic conditions from the quantity of interest, but still inform them through that physics-based model extrapolation. Furthermore, you could identify not just rate constants for better refinement with theoretical calculations, but you could pinpoint specific features of large potential energy surfaces that would be worth refining to improve predictions of some quantity that you're interested in. And these are the last results I'll show. These are just from a simultaneous design of experiments and theory calculations. The goal of these was to minimize uncertainties in propane air ignition delay times at high pressures. And the way you could seek minimizing those uncertainties is potential future experiments that you might run to measure OH at subatmospheric conditions. Conditions representative of the Sandia reactors, for example. They're subatmospheric reactors. Or potential higher level ab initio calculations of specific features of a potential energy surface. And so here are the results for the uncertainty in those propane air ignition delay times at high pressure. Here's the prior prediction shown in blue. And here are the results from just one calculation shown in pink, or one experiment shown in green. And so just to point out a couple things, one experiment or one calculation could reduce uncertainties from an order of magnitude to a factor of 3. An experiment even at subatmospheric pressures could still inform predictions at 50 atmospheres through physics-based extrapolation of those constraints. And then finally, a calculation would do almost as much as an experiment. In this case, a calculation of a single barrier height within this large potential energy surface could be refined and then provide a factor of 3 reduction in the uncertainty. So now, building off of this, we're starting to put together a reactor experiment in our group at Columbia with an emphasis on making it computer controlled for high throughput and automated operation, potentially, to use in conjunction with Bayesian design. And then the goal at this point is to link directly with uncertainty quantification to create a closed loop system for autonomous scientific inquiry. But that autonomous scientific inquiry is just a pipe dream, literally. We've got pipes and a working experiment, but it's not automated to the point that we're ready to walk away from it. So to conclude, and I see that I'm probably about out of time, we'll keep it simple. Extrapolation is hard. There's lots of factors, composition dependence, tons of reactions. There could be blind spots. But I think this combination of buzzwords, so theoretical chemistry, multiscale modeling, and uncertainty quantification could go a long way toward addressing those through a cohesive strategy for creating complex reaction models that you can extrapolate with some level of confidence that you can quantify and count on. So thanks for your attention. Thanks for your time on a Saturday morning or evening or night, and enjoy the rest of your day or night.
Okay, Mike, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. It is very interesting. Here I collected a few questions I would like to ask. And first is a clarification questions. I think from Professor John Daly, but he already got the answer. But it may not hurt for you to clarify again, how do you reduce the pressure?
It's the rate constant in the low pressure limit for a substance divided by the high pressure limit times the concentration. So the low pressure limit rate constant being proportional to the collision frequency and something known as the weak collision efficiency, which is the ratio of collisions that leads to stabilization. So not every collision, at least from this weak collision model, is effective. And so collision rate times the ratio of them that are effective.
I see. On slide number 40, so that is showing the acetylene air ignition curve.
Yeah.
1 atmosphere. So I'm kind of surprising there is no existing experimental data to verify this.
Thanks, Wenting, for the question. I will say the response to this question was edited after the fact. since for the purposes of a recorded video, we have the benefit of a couple days of running some extra calculations to better address it. First, one thing I will say is that most of the data that we're aware of at 1 atmosphere is at higher temperatures where the effects don't really show up. Now that said, there was a recent joint paper from Galway, Aachen, and Texas A&M at the 2018 symposium, and they had experiments at higher pressures and low temperatures. So Lele has rerun some calculations at those conditions. And the results of those say that chemically termolecular reactions, so this H plus acetylene plus O2, still impact the predictions by around a factor of 5 or so, again, speeding up the ignition delay. But one caveat to that is, to complicate matters, the paper indicates that there's some other reactions that are also important at the same conditions. So it's not necessarily a direct test of H plus acetylene plus O2, but it could be a key factor in terms of interpreting those data for generating complex kinetic models. Now that said, with that in mind, varying the O2 mole fraction would be the most direct method that I could think of for measuring the effect of non-Boltzmann effects or chemically termolecular reactions on the ignition delay time. Since the O2 mole fraction, as I mentioned earlier, directly adjusts that ratio of reactive to energy transferring collisions.
Okay, another question from Hao Zhao. For the mass burning rate with the pressure figure in page on slide 13, which reaction or reactions in these models are corresponding to the divergence at an elevated pressure?
Here they are, yeah. So I don't have the sensitivity analysis plot. This paper here would have it. From memory, I would say H plus O2 goes to OH and O, so the branching reaction. H plus O2 plus M, so that termolecular association reaction. Those are probably the two most important. From there, I'd say H plus HO2 and the two different pathways, at least for these, the conditions of this plot. Similar things were observed where there were other HO2 reactions that were relevant.
Next question from Matt Coquet. So most of the systems you have studied involve only a few H atoms. As molecules grow and the number of H atoms increase, would this process become more prominent?
So there's sort of two main aspects, or two main ways that these reactive collisions can influence the kinetics. You can have situations where the energy of these complexes can change the temperature dependence, or the mole fraction dependence of the products or the rates. And so you can get an enhancement due to the energy of AB star star in its reaction with C. You can also get in some enhancements due to the fact that if you're in the rate collision, or in the collision rate limited regime, so outside of the high pressure limit, then these reactive collisions can increase the overall flux through the system. As you get to larger molecules, I suspect that both of those might be suppressed from the standpoint that if you've got a very large molecule, it already have a lot of row vibrational energy. And so whatever this adds might be less. And that's something that I know that Raghu Sivakrishnan and Aaron Jasper have pointed out. Now, with regard to those kinetic effects of increasing the rate, I think if they're already in the high pressure limit, it might not matter so much. If they're weakly bound radicals or something that might be maybe a little bit closer to a low pressure limit, and you might have a different situation. But I would think there would systematically be less that I would expect for larger molecules. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mike. So next question from Joe Lefquist. How do we quantify uncertainty of ab initio calculations of different types? I see some error bars on calculations in your plot. Can you comment on these?
These are estimates. that are based on, let's see, some of them were Stephen Klippenstein's experience. That was the that was the source. I think they've gotten far more refined with their estimates. So I know Stephen and Carlo Cavallati have a paper where they're looking at the accuracy of different methods as compared to higher level benchmark calculations, or even experiments and things like that. And so I think those create much better, more quantitative results for where those error bars come from. But there's sort of rules of thumb for like level of calculation, like you do coupled cluster with singles and triples and all that stuff and basis sets. You can get estimates of what the error bars would be. And so that's what we use. Yeah, good question.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you, Mike. So let's move to the last question for today from Professor J. Gore. Acetylene error system at an equivalence ratio greater than 1.3, like 1.8 or 2, is so much more interesting. Did you consider this?
Thanks, Jay, for the question. This response is another one where we've run some calculations and we have the results to report instead of just saying, we'll run some calculations to find out. So Lei looked into this in an equivalence ratio of 2. The impact is very similar. It's something like a factor of 8 or so. If you go richer, it starts to go down a little bit, but it's still around a factor of 5. So it seems like it's still fairly significant, even at very rich conditions as well.
Okay, so everybody, thank you for attending this week's webinar. This is our inaugural Rising Star lectureships, and we will implement more similar lectures in the future. And thank you again. And we are finishing today. Thank you very much, Mike, to give us a wonderful lecture on Saturday morning.